This unauthorized commercial vehicle storage facility is creating liability exposure for our community. We're exercising emergency authority to seize this structure and convert it to proper residential use immediately. That's what Kenneth Sutherland announced while standing in his signature pink dress shirt and black dress pants beside my private ambulance garage, clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield, while his contractor prepared to padlock the doors that housed the emergency medical equipment that had saved 17 lives in his precious Meadowview estates over the past 3 years. The morning air carried the scent of antiseptic and diesel fuel, while Kenneth's voice echoed off the metal building my father had constructed in 1987 specifically for emergency medical response. His pink dress shirt gleaming with the kind of entitlement that thinks expensive clothing grants authority over emergency services infrastructure and life-saving equipment that had been operating under county authorization for nearly 4 decades. The sweet irony was that Kenneth's clipboard contained fake seizure orders, while my briefcase held something that would make his entire $95 million development disappear from emergency response maps forever. My county emergency medical services director credentials and the exclusive authority to terminate every ambulance service, paramedic response, and emergency medical authorization serving his community with one phone call to county dispatch. I'm Director Robert Mitchell, Senior County EMS official and former Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Enforcement Specialist, and I stood there in my red and black checkered flannel shirt and black pants, watching Kenneth prepare to seize my ambulance garage while calculating response time violations, emergency access obstruction charges, and the federal penalties that would make his pink dress shirt a prison uniform within months. What Kenneth didn't know, while he declared my emergency medical facility unauthorized commercial storage, was that every ambulance response, paramedic deployment, and emergency medical service in his development operated under protocols I controlled through 40 years of emergency medical administration and life safety enforcement expertise. His garage seizure wasn't just harassment. It was systematic obstruction of emergency medical services that would trigger county EMS enforcement, state health department investigation, and federal prosecutors who specialized in protecting America's emergency medical infrastructure from suburban terrorists in pink dress shirts who valued aesthetics over human survival. The beautiful irony was that Kenneth's emergency services obstruction would become the catalyst for his complete annihilation when federal agents arrested him for interfering with emergency medical operations, while I demonstrated exactly what happens when HOA presidents forget that ambulance response is regulated by county emergency services, not homeowner associations. In 6 weeks, his pink dress shirt would be replaced with orange prison clothing, while federal judges sentenced him to decades in prison for crimes against public safety and the emergency medical infrastructure that stands between his residence and preventable death from cardiac arrest, stroke, and trauma that require immediate paramedic intervention. What would you do if the HOA seized your private ambulance garage and claimed emergency medical equipment was creating liability exposure while threatening life-saving response capability? Where are you watching from? Drop your state below because this story will teach you exactly how emergency medical services law works, which agencies prosecute obstruction of emergency response, and the specific legal strategies that turn clipboard authority into federal terrorism charges when pink dress shirt tyrants forget that some facilities exist to save lives, not satisfy HOA aesthetic standards. After 40 years coordinating emergency medical response and protecting life-saving infrastructure from interference, neglect, and commercial exploitation, I'd earned my peaceful retirement on the 20-acre homestead my family had owned since territorial days. The property sat on elevated terrain in rural Virginia that provided strategic positioning for the private ambulance station my father had established in 1987, complete with a climate-controlled garage housing backup emergency medical equipment that served as secondary response capability when county ambulances were overwhelmed by simultaneous emergencies. The morning air smelled like medical-grade oxygen and equipment maintenance compounds, while the metal building reflected morning light that had warmed this life-saving facility for nearly 4 decades, creating the perfect setting for the Emergency Medical Training Center where I planned to teach my grandson Tommy advanced life support techniques that had saved hundreds of lives during my professional career. The ambulance garage itself was a masterpiece of 1980s emergency services engineering, constructed from commercial-grade steel with backup power systems, climate control for temperature-sensitive medications, and communications equipment that integrated seamlessly with county emergency dispatch protocols. Father had been a volunteer paramedic since 1972, serving as emergency medical coordinator for 3 counties and maintaining backup response capability during major incidents like the 1985 Air Florida crash that killed 78 people. The County Emergency Medical Services had recognized our station's public service record in 1990, designating it an authorized emergency medical facility with enhanced operating privileges and county protection under emergency service regulations that guaranteed our right to maintain effective medical response regardless of local zoning restrictions or HOA interference. My emergency medical equipment relied on sophisticated county-authorized protocols that positioned backup ambulances and advanced life support capability in strategic locations where primary response times exceeded critical intervention windows for cardiac arrest, stroke, and major trauma. The system operated under strict county regulations that protected it from interference while integrating perfectly with regional emergency medical services coordination. Then Meadowview Estates sprouted on adjacent valley floor like an expensive suburban infection, 347 McMansions with manicured lawns and enough HOA regulations to choke a trauma center. The development's residents were mostly wealthy retirees seeking exclusive community living without the visual clutter of emergency services infrastructure, ambulance stations, or life-saving equipment that reminded them of mortality and the medical emergencies that could strike without warning. Kenneth Sutherland arrived in Meadowview like a corporate virus, wearing expensive clothing and delusions of authority over emergency medical services law. Recently retired from some healthcare administration position where he'd apparently spent decades cutting costs and eliminating redundant emergency services to maximize profit margins, Kenneth wore his pink dress shirt and black dress pants like a uniform of suburban conquest. During HOA meetings, he spoke in buzzwords about liability optimization and aesthetic compliance, code language for eliminating emergency medical infrastructure through legal terrorism disguised as community risk management. Kenneth's obsession with my ambulance garage began during his first month as HOA president, when he declared my father's emergency medical facility a commercial eyesore that compromised his development's exclusive character and created unnecessary liability exposure for his HOA. The first warning shot came via certified mail, claiming my garage housed unauthorized commercial vehicles and created insurance liability that his HOA could eliminate through emergency seizure authority he didn't possess under county emergency services law or basic human decency toward life-saving infrastructure. I read the letter while standing in my workshop wearing my red and black checkered shirt, the fabric still carrying the scent of sawdust from the morning's woodworking, and I knew immediately that Kenneth had made the fatal mistake of attacking someone who controlled every emergency medical service keeping his community alive. Kenneth's escalation peaked when he hired liability consultants to assess my ambulance garage for community risk optimization. 3 unlicensed contractors whose expertise consisted of photographing emergency medical equipment they couldn't identify, while Kenneth supervised from his air-conditioned BMW, his pink dress shirt pressed crisp as his arrogance. Their assessment recommended immediate facility closure, vehicle removal, and liability elimination that would destroy emergency medical backup capability while violating county regulations protecting authorized emergency medical facilities from local interference. The morning sun caught the fabric of his pink dress shirt as he gestured dismissively at the ambulance that had saved Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's life during her cardiac arrest 3 months earlier, treating life-saving equipment like aesthetic pollution that needed removal for suburban perfection. I watched from my porch in my red and black checkered shirt, arms crossed, calculating every violation he was committing while his contractors measured and photographed equipment that had prevented 17 deaths in his own community. Dr. James Wilson, an emergency medical services administrator I'd worked with during my county EMS career, reviewed Kenneth's closure proposals with professional horror that bordered on medical ethics violations. "Robert, these modifications would systematically destroy authorized emergency medical backup capability while violating county EMS regulations protecting life-saving infrastructure," he reported while examining plans that showed Kenneth's complete ignorance of emergency medical services law and the critical intervention windows that separate survival from preventable death. He's recommending changes that would constitute willful obstruction of emergency medical services, creating county violations that carry substantial criminal penalties under public safety statutes written specifically to prevent exactly this kind of interference with life-saving response capability. But Kenneth's biggest mistake was underestimating who he was attacking. A simple internet search would have revealed my 40-year career coordinating emergency medical response, my current position as county EMS director with exclusive authority over all emergency medical services, and my direct control over the ambulance deployment protocols and paramedic response authorizations that kept his precious Meadowview residents alive when cardiac arrest, stroke, and trauma struck without warning or regard for HOA aesthetic standards. The emergency medical infrastructure serving Kenneth's development wasn't just county ambulances responding from distant stations. It included my backup facility that reduced response times from 12 minutes to 4 minutes for the eastern section of his community. The difference between brain damage and full recovery for stroke victims, between survival and death for cardiac arrest patients. These response time improvements had been documented through county emergency medical services studies that showed my facility's strategic positioning saved an average of 2.3 lives annually in his development alone. My professional response was methodical and devastating, beginning with a formal complaint to the County Emergency Medical Services Board, documenting every violation while Kenneth watched from his BMW, pink dress shirt reflecting in the windshield like a beacon of his impending prosecution. I contacted County EMS Operations Director Rebecca Torres, a no-nonsense administrator who'd spent 20 years enforcing regulations that keep emergency medical response effective and protected from interference. I made the call from my kitchen table, my red and black checkered shirt sleeves rolled up as I spread county authorization documents across the surface, each page representing another nail in Kenneth's legal coffin. Director Mitchell, this represents systematic targeting of authorized emergency medical backup facilities and willful obstruction of life-saving response capability, she confirmed after reviewing my documentation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted emergency services obstruction cases across multiple jurisdictions. Your facility operates under county authorization that protects it from local interference, and Kenneth's activities constitute criminal obstruction under emergency services protection statutes that carry decades in prison for anyone stupid enough to interfere with life-saving medical response infrastructure. Special Agent David Rodriguez from the FBI's Public Safety Crimes Unit coordinated federal response with surgical precision. Director Mitchell, your ambulance facility provides critical backup emergency medical response that has saved documented lives, he explained during our secure briefing at the local FBI field office, where I sat in my red and black checkered shirt across from federal agents who understood exactly what Kenneth's obstruction meant for public safety. Kenneth isn't just committing harassment, he's planning systematic obstruction of federally protected emergency medical services that constitutes domestic terrorism under statutes written specifically to prosecute attacks on life-saving public safety infrastructure. The FBI's involvement transformed Kenneth's garage seizure into a federal investigation targeting organized criminal activity that threatened protected emergency medical infrastructure. My county EMS contacts prepared enforcement actions that would demonstrate exactly what happens when HOA presidents attack the emergency medical officials who control their community's access to life-saving paramedic response. Dr. Evan Reed's forensic analysis of Kenneth's HOA finances revealed systematic embezzlement through shell companies and kickback schemes. $800,000 stolen through inflated contractor invoices and fake liability assessments, Reed reported, while spreading evidence across my kitchen table where I sat in my red and black checkered shirt, morning light illuminating financial crimes that would make federal judges reach for maximum sentences. Kenneth used phantom insurance studies to justify unnecessary spending, then laundered money through his brother's property management company, while residents paid for systematic obstruction of emergency medical services that had saved 17 documented lives in their own community. The first test of Kenneth's criminal stupidity came when county EMS inspectors arrived for routine monitoring of my authorized emergency medical facility, only to find Kenneth's contractors had already begun preliminary closure procedures that included disconnecting backup power systems and removing emergency medical equipment with moving trucks that treated life-saving apparatus like furniture being hauled to storage. The county inspectors immediately called state health department emergency specialists, who arrived to find Kenneth directing operations while wearing his pink dress shirt like a uniform of emergency medical obstruction, completely unaware that I was watching from my property in my red and black checkered shirt, documenting every federal crime with high-definition cameras and county-authorized recording equipment. Kenneth's response to county investigation revealed his complete disconnection from emergency medical reality, standing in his pink dress shirt at an emergency HOA meeting while claiming his facility closure would reduce community liability through emergency services optimization. The meeting was recorded by residents, creating audio evidence of Kenneth's callous disregard for life-saving medical response that prosecutors would present to juries who understood that ambulance response times determine survival rates for cardiac arrest, stroke, and trauma. The federal investigation accelerated when county emergency medical services specialists discovered Kenneth had been systematically researching other private emergency medical facilities throughout Virginia, his computer files containing closure reports and seizure proposals targeting 19 additional authorized backup ambulance stations across 4 counties. His pink dress shirt had become a familiar sight at emergency medical facilities where he'd posed for photographs while calculating liability exposure and closure costs of life-saving infrastructure that had documented records of preventing deaths through rapid emergency medical intervention. Meanwhile, I coordinated the federal response from my home office, sitting in my red and black checkered shirt with county maps spread across my desk, marking every facility Kenneth had targeted and building a case that would demonstrate his systematic pattern of emergency services terrorism. Dr. James Wilson, a federal emergency medical services protection specialist, analyzed Kenneth's closure plans with professional horror. This represents coordinated attack on authorized emergency medical backup infrastructure disguised as liability management, he testified during preliminary hearings, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the consequences of allowing emergency services obstruction to go unpunished. Mr. Sutherland has systematically targeted county-authorized life-saving facilities while using fraudulent insurance assessments to legitimize commercial obstruction of emergency medical response capability that has documented evidence of preventing deaths through rapid paramedic intervention. The civil lawsuits began immediately after Kenneth's county arrest, with emergency medical organizations and public safety advocacy groups filing damages claims against Kenneth, his HOA board, and every contractor involved in his emergency services obstruction conspiracy. Attorney Sarah Chen argued that Kenneth's deliberate targeting of authorized emergency medical facilities constituted public safety terrorism, warranting punitive damages exceeding his personal assets. I attended every hearing in my red and black checkered shirt, sitting in the gallery where Kenneth could see exactly who had destroyed his life through legitimate county authority and federal law enforcement coordination. Kenneth's desperate final gambit was attempting to claim liability protection authority for his garage seizure project, filing emergency motions arguing his closure would reduce community insurance exposure through emergency services elimination. The legal theory was so absurd it violated basic public safety principles protecting emergency medical response. But Kenneth pressed forward with motions that became evidence of his systematic criminal intent to profit from emergency services obstruction while endangering hundreds of lives for aesthetic preferences and imaginary liability reduction. The FBI's financial investigation revealed Kenneth's emergency services obstruction had been funded through systematic embezzlement from HOA reserves and kickback schemes involving his brother's property management company. Special Agent Rodriguez discovered Kenneth had stolen $1.9 million from community funds while creating systematic liability for emergency medical obstruction that would bankrupt his HOA and personally destroy every board member who'd approved his life-threatening closure enterprise. The catastrophic test came when 73-year-old Robert Henderson suffered massive cardiac arrest in Meadowview's eastern section at 3:47 a.m. on a cold November morning. County dispatch deployed the nearest ambulance from the primary station 12 miles away. But my backup facility that Kenneth had just closed would have responded in 4 minutes instead of the 11 minutes it took the distant ambulance to arrive. Robert Henderson died in his driveway while his wife performed CPR, waiting for the ambulance that arrived 7 minutes too late because Kenneth had eliminated the backup emergency medical capability that would have saved his life. I received the call at 4:15 a.m., standing in my kitchen in my red and black checkered shirt and black pants, coffee growing cold in my hands as the county dispatcher explained that we'd just experienced our first preventable death due to Kenneth's emergency services obstruction. The death investigation revealed Kenneth's garage seizure had directly caused preventable death through systematic obstruction of authorized emergency medical backup response. County medical examiners documented that 4-minute response from my facility would have provided a 68% survival probability, while 11-minute response reduced survival to 12%. Kenneth's aesthetic concerns had killed a man whose survival depended on the emergency medical infrastructure Kenneth had eliminated for HOA liability management and suburban perfection. But the real devastation came when I implemented the complete emergency medical services adjustment Kenneth had unknowingly triggered through his obstruction and the preventable death it had caused. As county EMS director, I had documented sufficient evidence of systematic obstruction of authorized emergency medical facilities to justify emergency response protocol modification for all areas where HOA interference had compromised life-saving capability. I made the decision sitting at my desk in my red and black checkered shirt, signing the county directive that would teach Kenneth and his community exactly what happens when you eliminate emergency medical infrastructure. The first domino fell when I issued a formal county EMS directive reclassifying Meadowview Estates from Priority Response Zone to Standard Response Zone, effectively reducing their emergency medical service priority to the lowest tier reserved for areas that had demonstrated hostility to emergency services infrastructure. The reclassification meant that during simultaneous emergency incidents when resources were limited, Meadowview residents would receive ambulances only after all priority response zones had been served, potentially adding critical minutes to response times during peak demand periods. Next, I suspended the mutual aid agreements that had authorized my backup facility to provide supplemental emergency medical response to Meadowview, citing HOA interference with authorized emergency medical operations as grounds for termination. The county attorneys supported the suspension, noting that continued emergency medical services to communities that actively obstruct life-saving infrastructure created liability exposure for county operations and endangered paramedics who might face future HOA interference during emergency responses. Within 48 hours, Kenneth's $95 million development had been effectively downgraded to the lowest priority for emergency medical response in the entire county. No backup ambulance capability, reduced response priority during peak demand, and average response times that had increased from 4 minutes to 12 minutes. The difference between survival and death for cardiac arrest and stroke victims who required immediate advanced life support intervention. The community that had supported Kenneth's aesthetic crusade was now living with the consequences of eliminating emergency medical infrastructure, and every resident understood that Robert Henderson's preventable death was just the beginning of what happens when you obstruct life-saving services for HOA compliance. The federal trial began with media coverage that transformed Kenneth's pink dress shirt into a national symbol of public safety terrorism and systematic obstruction of life-saving emergency medical services. His image broadcast across every major network as prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of emergency services obstruction, preventable death causation, and criminal conspiracy that had endangered emergency medical response for aesthetic preferences while embezzling community funds. I attended every day of the trial in my red and black checkered shirt, sitting in the front row of the gallery where Kenneth could see exactly who had built the case that would send him to federal prison for decades. Kenneth's defense crumbled under cross-examination, revealing his complete ignorance of emergency medical services law and basic respect for life-saving infrastructure that separates civilized communities from preventable death zones. Wearing standard business clothing instead of his signature pink dress shirt, Kenneth appeared diminished and pathetic, while prosecutors played recordings of him defending his garage seizure during active death investigation, his voice carrying the kind of callous disregard for human life that made jurors visibly angry at his systematic prioritization of aesthetics over survival. County EMS Operations Director Rebecca Torres delivered testimony that ended Kenneth's defense permanently, her professional authority carrying the weight of 20 years protecting life-saving infrastructure from exactly the kind of obstruction Kenneth had committed. Mr. Sutherland's actions represent the most egregious violation of emergency medical services protection I've encountered in 20 years of public safety enforcement, she stated, while prosecutors displayed photographs of the closed ambulance garage and Robert Henderson's death scene. The images creating a visual narrative of preventable tragedy caused by pink dress shirt tyranny. His closure project was specifically designed to eliminate authorized emergency medical backup capability that had documented evidence of saving lives through rapid paramedic response, prioritizing aesthetic concerns and imaginary liability reduction over proven life-saving infrastructure. Dr. James Wilson's emergency medical services analysis demonstrated how Kenneth's closure violated every principle of public safety established by decades of emergency medical research and trauma care science. This represents systematic obstruction of authorized life-saving infrastructure disguised as liability management, he testified, while reviewing response time studies and survival probability calculations that showed Kenneth's garage seizure had created predictable conditions for preventable death. Kenneth eliminated emergency medical backup capability that had statistically significant evidence of preventing deaths through rapid advanced life support intervention, prioritizing aesthetic concerns over documented life-saving response capability that medical science has proven essential for cardiac arrest and stroke survival. The financial evidence presented by FBI forensic accountants revealed Kenneth had systematically embezzled HOA funds while enriching family members through inflated contractor invoices and kickback schemes designed to profit from emergency services obstruction. Special Agent Rodriguez testified about discovering $1.9 million in stolen community funds, fake liability assessments used to justify emergency medical elimination, and shell companies designed to launder money through Kenneth's brother's property management business that specialized in facility closures and emergency services obstruction for aesthetic compliance. Robert Henderson's widow delivered devastating victim impact testimony that brought tears to jurors' eyes and demonstrated the human cost of Kenneth's aesthetic terrorism. "My husband died in our driveway while I performed CPR for 7 minutes, waiting for an ambulance that would have arrived in 4 minutes if Kenneth hadn't closed the backup station for aesthetic reasons and imaginary liability concerns," she testified, her voice breaking with grief and rage at the preventable nature of her husband's death. "Kenneth Sutherland killed my husband to improve property values and eliminate what he called visual clutter and insurance liability. That visual clutter was life-saving emergency medical equipment that would have kept Robert alive. And that imaginary liability was actually the infrastructure that protected our community from preventable death." The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its moral clarity and medical precision. Kenneth Sutherland didn't just steal money or violate HOA regulations, Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert King stated, while gesturing toward photographs of Kenneth's pink dress shirt evidence and Robert Henderson's memorial. He systematically obstructed authorized emergency medical services, causing the preventable death of Robert Henderson and endangering every resident in Meadowview Estates through elimination of proven life-saving infrastructure. This isn't just obstruction, this is public safety terrorism that killed an innocent man whose only crime was living in a community where the HOA president valued aesthetics more than human survival. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison delivered Kenneth's fate with gravity reserved for those who cause preventable deaths through criminal obstruction of public safety infrastructure. "Mr. Sutherland, you systematically obstructed authorized emergency medical services while embezzling community funds, directly causing the preventable death of Robert Henderson through elimination of backup response capability that medical science has proven essential for cardiac arrest and stroke survival. Your conduct represents callous disregard for human life that demands maximum federal consequences under laws written specifically to protect emergency medical infrastructure from exactly the kind of aesthetic terrorism you systematically committed for personal profit and suburban perfection." The sentence was devastating and appropriate for someone who'd killed through emergency services obstruction. 24 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture totaling $5.2 million, and restitution exceeding $32 million to emergency medical services restoration funds and the Henderson family wrongful death settlement that would ensure Robert's widow could live comfortably for the rest of her life. Kenneth's pink dress aesthetic crusade had cost him everything, while proving that some infrastructure exists for purposes more important than property values, and interfering with emergency medical response has fatal consequences that no amount of suburban perfection can justify. Kenneth's garage seizure equipment was confiscated by federal marshals and destroyed, symbolically eliminating his tools of emergency services obstruction. And my ambulance facility was restored to full operational capability with enhanced county protection and federal oversight that would prevent future HOA interference. The restoration project became a national model for emergency medical services protection that attracted support from public safety organizations, emergency medical associations, and federal agencies committed to protecting life-saving infrastructure from aesthetic terrorism and HOA obstruction. I oversaw the entire restoration wearing my red and black checkered shirt, working alongside county technicians to ensure every system was upgraded and protected from future interference by pink dress shirt tyrants who valued property values over human survival. Kenneth Sutherland remains incarcerated in high-security federal prison, his appeals exhausted, early release requests consistently denied by federal judges who recognize emergency medical obstruction that causes preventable death as unforgivable attack on public safety infrastructure. Prison officials report he remains unrepentant, still claiming he was managing community liability and showing no understanding that his aesthetic concerns killed Robert Henderson through systematic elimination of proven life-saving response capability. This attitude ensures he'll serve his full 24-year sentence while Robert Henderson's widow visits his grave weekly, knowing that Kenneth's pink dress shirt aesthetic crusade destroyed her family for suburban perfection. The broader impact extended far beyond Virginia, as the federal prosecution became a landmark case setting legal precedents for prosecuting HOA officials who obstruct emergency medical services and cause preventable deaths through interference with authorized life-saving infrastructure. The Henderson Emergency Services Protection Act, new federal legislation inspired by this case and named for the man whose preventable death exposed the dangers of HOA aesthetic terrorism, now mandates enhanced penalties for emergency medical obstruction and strengthens county EMS enforcement authority while providing federal resources for protecting backup ambulance facilities from local interference. For anyone facing similar attacks on emergency medical facilities, the lessons are crystal clear and potentially life-saving for your community. First, document everything meticulously. Every letter, email, threat, and obstruction incident involving emergency medical infrastructure, because county EMS directors and federal prosecutors take emergency services obstruction seriously and respond with full investigative authority when provided with comprehensive evidence of systematic interference with life-saving response capability. Second, know your rights under emergency services protection law, especially concerning authorized backup facilities and county protocols that protect emergency medical infrastructure from local interference, regardless of HOA and aesthetic preferences or imaginary liability concerns. Third, contact county EMS enforcement immediately when HOAs threaten life-saving infrastructure, because emergency medical services directors have exclusive authority to prosecute obstruction and can mobilize state health department and FBI investigation resources that local authorities cannot match for public safety crimes. Fourth, build coalitions with emergency medical organizations, paramedic associations, and public safety advocacy groups who have both moral authority and legal resources to fight emergency services obstruction through federal courts and congressional intervention that can establish nationwide precedents protecting life-saving infrastructure. Finally, never let fear prevent you from defending emergency medical capability against aesthetic interference by pink dress shirt tyrants who think HOA authority supersedes public safety law and human survival. Kenneth thought his position made him untouchable, that he could obstruct life-saving services and eliminate proven emergency medical backup capability with impunity while hiding behind expensive clothing and clipboard authority that meant nothing to county EMS directors who control emergency response and federal prosecutors who specialize in protecting public safety infrastructure from aesthetic terrorism. His 24-year federal prison sentence and Robert Henderson's preventable death prove that some infrastructure exists to save lives rather than satisfy aesthetic preferences. And interfering with emergency medical response has fatal consequences that no amount of aesthetic improvement, property value protection, or imaginary liability reduction can justify when measured against human survival and the proven life-saving capability of authorized backup emergency medical facilities. 2 years later, I stood beside my restored ambulance garage in my red and black checkered shirt, breathing air that smelled like medical oxygen and justice, while morning sunlight illuminated equipment that continued saving lives Kenneth had tried to eliminate for aesthetic compliance and liability management. His emergency services obstruction had been the catalyst for his complete destruction, proving that some facilities exist for purposes more important than property values and suburban perfection, and that America's emergency medical infrastructure has defenders who will protect life-saving response capability from aesthetic terrorism that kills innocent people, whose only crime was living in communities where HOA presidents valued pink dress shirt authority more than human survival. The memorial plaque we installed at the ambulance garage entrance honors Robert Henderson's memory while warning future HOA officials about the consequences of obstructing emergency medical services. In memory of Robert Henderson, whose preventable death on November 15th exposed the fatal consequences of emergency medical obstruction. This facility saves lives. Interfere at your peril. Every time I read those words in my red and black checkered shirt, I remember why some battles are worth fighting with every ounce of county authority and federal law enforcement coordination, and why pink dress shirt tyrants who obstruct life-saving infrastructure deserve every year of their federal prison sentences. What would you do if the HOA seized your emergency medical facility and caused preventable deaths through aesthetic terrorism? Share your emergency services protection story below. Your experience might help someone else defending life-saving infrastructure from obstruction that kills innocent people. Subscribe for more justice stories where pink dress shirt tyrants learn that some facilities exist to save lives rather than satisfy aesthetic preferences. And the price of obstructing emergency medical response is measured in decades behind federal prison bars where they can contemplate the difference between property values and human survival while Robert Henderson's widow visits his grave knowing that justice was finally served.